All right, let me make sure everything's working. Let me, okay, there we go. Blessed are the meek.
I never got your thing.
I'm sorry?
I never got your plug-in, that's why.
No, you got my plug-in. I gave it to Gwyneth, and she laid it on the counter, she said somewhere.
Oh, I see. It was not plugged in.
No, apparently something else was plugged in at the time.
All right, try now.
Okay. Let me turn it off and turn it back on.
All right, I'm
No,
gonna click. All right, click.
no.
All right, let me try a different port.
Okay, sorry.
Try again.
There we go.
Huzzah.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. You know, every week I leave here thinking, okay, next week I'm going to pick up the pace. We're going to get through these Beatitudes. And then I go home and I start doing the studying, and you know, it starts expanding. It's like spaghetti; it just gets bigger and bigger. And we're not going to get beyond meekness this morning. This is fun stuff. I mean, there's so much stuff out there, and it is so challenging. In fact, one of the hazards of being the Sunday school teacher is that as I go through this throughout the week, I have opportunities to exhibit meekness. And this week I failed in those opportunities to exhibit meekness. And you know, by the time you get to Wednesday or Thursday, I'm thinking, how can I teach this on Sunday without being the biggest hypocrite in the building? So bear with me. We are still going through this together. And the thing about blessed are the meek, you know, with this beatitude, Jesus is giving us a challenge. With the first two, blessed are the poor in spirit. Everybody's poor in spirit. Some of us just don't know it. We're all spiritually impoverished. And really that blessing is more of, blessed are you when you realize that you're poor in spirit. Blessed are those that mourn. Yeah, we all mourn. Okay? Tori's family is going through mourning. Okay? We all mourning. We all mourn. And because of that, you know, that's universal. Meekness. We're not meek. If we're honest, we don't want to be meek. Nobody in America looks up to a meek person and says, boy, I admire that guy. No, we admire the strong, the bold, the proud. Okay? And now Jesus is challenging us. And he's saying, no. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And so, to me, both sides of this are challenging in that, what does Jesus mean by meekness? And what in the world does he mean by inheriting the earth? And the scholars are all over the board on both of those questions. And so we're just going to have some fun this morning. So let's start off with the vocabulary. The Greek word for meek in this verse is praus. And it's an interesting word. It only appears actually 4 times in the New Testament, the actual adjective meek. Meekness appears a lot more than that, but the adjective meek only appears 4 times. It appears here, over in Matthew 11, where Jesus says, come to me all you are heavily laden, and I will give you rest. He says, learn of me, for I am meek. So it appears there. Later on in Matthew, that we'll see the triumphal entry. Give praise to Jesus, for your king is coming on a donkey, meek and humble. It appears there. And then it appears in one of Peter's letters when he's talking about an attitude that wives should have. Talks about wives being meek. And those are only 4 times that this word appears in the New Testament. It does appear many more times in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in the Septuagint. And interestingly enough, I didn't check all of them, but in many of them, the Greek word praus for meek in the Old Testament is a translation of the Hebrew word that got translated as poor in spirit. So there's a link between the two. There's a connection, so much so that the Greek translators translated the Hebrew word for poor into meek. But let's get one thing clear right from the get-go. Meek ain't weak. Meekness is not weakness. Don't confuse the two. There are many, many weak people who are not very meek at all. Okay? And there are very, very many strong people who are very meek. And I'll give a couple of examples here in a second. But let's get this very clear right from the get-go. Don't confuse meekness with weakness. Okay? And on this point, I got a real big help from William Barclay. He's got a book that I use a lot, New Testament Words. And in that book, he goes through, gives a little chapter on Greek words. And he explains what they mean. And he doesn't have them all, obviously. He can't, it'd be a massive book. But he gets the highlights. And he's got a chapter on meekness. And this is what he has to say. He says, the man who is praus, or meek, is under perfect control. It is not a spineless gentleness, a sentimental fondness, a passive quietism. It is a strength under control. And I love that. Okay? Jesus isn't telling us, find a way to be weak. He's telling us to be meek. Strength under control. And he has this line in his book. He goes on to say that the meek man is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time. And so, there's a time to be angry. Usually, at least in my life, I pick the wrong times to be angry. And then there are times not to be angry, and usually those are the times when I often choose to be angry. Okay? And it takes a great deal of wisdom to know the difference. And most of us are often struggling with this. But when I think about strong people being meek, my mind goes back, and sometimes it's really good being old because you can draw on examples from years ago. And I go back to the 1960s. The Los Angeles Rams had a defensive front four called the Fearsome Foursome. Yeah. You guys remember the Fearsome Foursome? Well, two of those guys on the Fearsome Foursome that I want to highlight this morning were Roosevelt Greer and Merlin Olsen. Okay? Rosie Greer, big, burly guy. His job was to knock quarterbacks on their backs. Okay? And he did that. And that's what he was supposed to do. And when he retired, he became famous for his hobby. Anybody remember his hobby? Needlework. He got famous for his needlepoint.
Oh, that's right.
He loved doing needlepoint. This big, burly, defensive guard, tackle, whatever they're called. His big deal was needlepoint. Merlin Olsen, when he retired, he became an announcer. And I'd be watching the football games on Sunday, and he'd be he was on the main team, I think, for NBC. And I was amazed by how soft-spoken he was. I mean, he was very soft-spoken for such a big man. And I'm trying to.
In the House on the Prairie?
Yeah.
Yes,
That's what I remember.
He did acting. He was on Little House on the Prairie as a very Highway to Heaven.
Yeah.
He did the Michael Landon series. He played I think a preacher on Little House on the Prairie. He played an Amish man in a movie, and his biggest claim to fame later on was he became the spokesman for FTD florists. This big, strong, powerful football player made a living selling flowers. Okay? And to me, and that made an impact on me. You know, I was in my teens and early 20s, and seeing this guy, he could beat up all of us in this room at the same time. But he had no need to flaunt his strength. He had no need to shout and scream and yell. Like I said, I mean, you know, the thing that was so amazing, he was probably the most soft-spoken football announcer I ever recall hearing on TV. And to me, I think those two guys are examples of strong men who, in fact, were meek. Okay? The Bible gives us a couple other examples. This is Numbers 12:3, and I'm taking this from an English translation of the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint, and this is where that praus is used in the Old Testament, talking about Moses. And the man Moses was very meek beyond all the men that were upon the earth. I'll be honest, I was kind of surprised when I saw this. I have read this before, but in doing this study, it's sort of like I saw it again for the first time. And I thought, Moses? You know, yeah, he had a stuttering problem. We know that. But, I mean, Charlton Heston, okay, come on. Like, how many of us picture Moses as meek beyond all the men that were upon the earth?
And as one of the descriptions in the Bible is, there's no one that did the works of God like Moses. The power, the miracles.
Yeah. It's amazing. How many of us would picture Moses as meek? I don't picture that. And again, Hollywood has helped with my imagination with Charlton Heston and all of that. And then we see Jesus, and this is the other verse I was mentioning, the triumphal entry. And here in Matthew 21:5, this is actually a quote from Zechariah 9, where Matthew says, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Okay, that word humble there, that's the Greek word praus, meek. So we have Moses and Jesus, who are both declared to be meek. Interesting trivia. On Matthew 21 there, the triumphal entry, Jesus is coming in on a donkey. I've read recently from many different sources, so I think there's probably some validity to this, that when a king rode into war, he rode on a horse. But when he went on a mission of peace, he rode on a donkey. And there's an allusion to Solomon in, I believe, 2 Kings. And I don't have the verse where Solomon is told, somebody tells Solomon, go to this city on a donkey. The implication being that this is a mission of peace. So I think there's some significance to that Jesus is riding on the donkey as he comes into Jerusalem, that this is a mission of peace. So, what is meekness? Let me just throw that out to you. We can see that meekness is not the same as weakness, but what is meekness? How do we describe it? You know, Jesus is saying, blessed are the meek. And this is, like I say, it's different from the other Beatitudes we've seen so far, because meekness is a choice. Meekness is something we choose. It's not something that is inherent or inbred in us.
In the Spanish, the translation for meek is manso. But it's Spanish, which lots of times happen, they have two different words for similar thoughts and things, but they define them differently, such as picante and caliente. Picante is spicy hot, caliente is temperature hot. But in this case, manso, M-A-N-S-O, means this type of, with strength.
Restraint.
Restraint.
Under restraint.
But the other word is menso, M-E-N-S-O. that means weak-minded
Okay.
or simple-minded.
Simple mind,
That-
okay.
That's used for people that they have no way to make themselves impose on others. But
Okay.
they're just because of their maybe intellectual or
Yeah.
physical lack of strength.
Okay.
And so they can't do. And so that's, in Spanish it comes across that way. Manso, of course, is what fits in here. And that means someone being strong
Mhm.
controls themselves.
Yeah. Being strong and control. Yeah, Allison.
I've heard the Monson translation, and I've heard it equated to actually like a horse. A horse is a very strong animal, but when you fit in its mouth and it's well trained and it listens, that little tiny bit, it follows and listens to what the master is saying.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't take away from the strength of the horse or the power that that horse has, but it's actually listening to its master.
Yeah, Barclay uses the illustration of the horse in his book, the chapter that I was just referring to. So yeah, you've got the very strong animal that will be meek and submissive under the right circumstances. Okay, let's look at what some of the guys that I've been reading and see what they have to say. Let's start off with St. Augustine. In his book on the Sermon on the Mount, this is what he has to say. And I'm just want to open this up and see how you react to it. The meek are those who yield to acts of wickedness and do not resist evil, but overcome evil with good. What do you think of that? Yeah, Margaret.
That's what always moves me the most about Jesus and the cross. I mean, he didn't resist. He let them do, he was their creator.
Okay.
And he let them do all of this, but he was doing it because he loved them. And he asked, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, so.
Okay, so you have the example of Jesus on the cross. Ken?
I have a problem with that statement.
I knew that I knew somebody would.
Yeah, I think you can be a big person and still not yield to acts of wickedness.
Okay.
I have a problem with that, yielding to acts of wickedness.
Okay.
Well,
What are
maybe.
they saying by acts of wickedness? Are they just saying that you don't come out fighting them with a sword, or that you participate in them? That would be the
Well,
difference.
What I find interesting, okay, take your Bibles. You have to take your Bibles for this one, because I don't have a slide on it. I mean, Augustine's not coming up with these words on his own. I mean, it's sort of a paraphrase of some other stuff. But, that was my first reaction too, Ken. I had the same reaction, yielding to acts of wickedness. That's strongly worded. But let's go to Matthew 5. We're in the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount. And this is going to be a preview of where we'll get probably this time next year, the way I'm going. Yeah. And as soon as I can find it, here we go. Okay. Matthew 5, we're looking at verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. I mean, that's very similar to what we've got there, at least in the second line, the third line down. Do not resist evil. Do not resist an evildoer. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give him your cloak as well. I'm a lawyer. I spent my life defending lawsuits. And never once did I tell my client, just roll over and let the guy take all your money. So, yeah, Buck.
I think so much of this is culturally sensitive because, as you said, our culture elevates strength and the power of self and the flesh.
Yeah.
And so we're surrounded with it with ways we don't even realize, or we're influenced by it. But then you hear about Corrie ten Boom. You hear about others who do not resist evil, but they love. They return evil with love, and they win. And so, as one who has been, for all my life, influenced by our culture before I even heard about Jesus and was trying to walk with him, it really requires the Holy Spirit to have any way to change, any hope to change.
Yeah, yeah. And like I said, I don't want to get into broad brush blanket statements that, you know, one size fits all situations, because it's so difficult. Allison, bail me out, help me.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to trusting that God is gonna bring about justice. Because I think a lot of times when we try to overcome the wickedness, we want justice now, and we want justice our way.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's very difficult to put that trust in Him and to know that God says, no, I'm the one that brings about justice, and just handing that over. And
Yep.
again, that's a sense of giving up power. You're giving up power there.
Right. Yeah, but think about the strength of it. I mean, usually, even in the field of lawsuits, you're fighting over money. I mean, most lawsuits are a fight over money. And I remember when people would come into my office and they would say, you know, it's not the money, it's the principle of the thing. And you know, I would hear that and I'd say, well, fine, but don't waste the court's time. The court isn't interested in principles. Lawsuits are about money. I hate to sound mercenary about it, but that's what it is. Lawsuits are about money. You can deal with principles outside of the court system. And lawsuits are about money. And when you think about it, the real winner is a person who is not so enslaved to money that they feel the need to bash each other over the head, either physically or emotionally or spiritually, to fight over money. When we can get to the point where when our love of money is so poor in our lives that we can see things go and say, you know what, it's okay. You know, I don't need another $500,000. Okay, I can let this go because God is with me. I'm not going to be a slave to money. And so often the position that we take in our dealings with other people is we are fighting so much over the money that it can be freeing when you can say, you know what, it's just not that big of a deal. And that's totally not how we live. Okay, I'm getting some hands. Buck.
This will take a minute, but it's for you as an attorney. During the 10 years that I worked with my friend in the business committed to Christ, where we were striving to apply the Bible in as many business relationships and situations as we could, we were sued by one of our best customers for something that we did not do. Absolutely no question.
Mm-hmm.
Our attorney said, you should sue them. This is a malicious suit.
Mm-hmm.
This was a multi-million-dollar company and a very good client. And we did not know what to do. We knew we didn't want to sue them.
Right.
It was not, and so we prayed and we began to fast. And I was on a business trip to Scotland, and I called the office at the end of the day and talked to my friend who was the CEO. And he said, I think I'm very excited. I got some good news for you. I know what we need to do with our suit. I said, what? He said, turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 40. He said, if your enemy says you ask for your shirt, give him your cloak as well. And I said, well, yeah, but how do you see that applies to the suit? He said, I think we should drop our defense and just say, we'll give you whatever you want. And I said, wow. He said, they could put us right out of business. We didn't have a lot of money at all. And he said, look, if God owns this business, they can't do that.
Amen.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's right.
Amen.
And he had the guts and the courage to go to the court and ask the judge, could he read that verse into the court record and say, we are not going to defend ourselves, we're innocent of what we are charged, but because of Matthew 5:40, we're going to say to this company, ask what you will, I will give it to you. And he did that. And the judge said to the steward person, company, well, what is it you want? He said, gee, we don't really know you. He said, well, you better figure it out by tomorrow morning. Because if you don't ask for anything, you're gonna get nothing. So they asked about $250,000, which in perspective was probably close to half the net worth of the company, and no way we could ever raise it. But here's where God entered in. They asked for it as a percentage of sales on the particular product they were upset about over 5 years with a balloon payment at the end of 5 years. So no money down, 5 years to pay. So we went out of business. We went about our business as we had been, trying to honor God with the business. And next year, we made a $1 million pre-tax profit selling the products that were in question, and within 2 years, we were able to pay them $250,000. Unrighteous on their part, but look what God did in our company.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's when we trust God, a true act of faith, you don't know what He's going to do.
Right.
More to there.
I mean, yeah, there are a couple things that you've said I just want to highlight. And for those of you on YouTube, I'll try to summarize this. Buck was involved in a business that got sued, and they decided to follow Matthew 5:40 and just simply say, okay, we'll give you what you want, even though they felt they were in the right. And a couple things. First of all, Buck, you made the comment that your partner had the courage and the strength to go in and be meek. The courage and the strength. I mean, what courage and strength does it take to go into a court and say, we're going to follow what Jesus says, and without knowing what the result's going to be? That's courage and strength. The other thing that happened, and I'm sort of surmising this based on what you said, is that when you went in and said, okay, we're going to follow what Jesus has to say, your opponent now has to come up, okay, what do I want?
Yeah, right.
And they came up with something that was doable. I mean, they didn't ask, I'm assuming they didn't ask for the moon. My gut tells me that if you had gone in there with guns blazing, they would have dug in their heels and they would not have been satisfied with $250,000. They would have wanted a whole lot more. But because you went in with a heart of meekness, and basically you told them, we're going to turn the other cheek here, it made them pause and sit back and say, okay, well, what do we honestly think is fair? Now, you were in the right. I'm sure they felt that they were in the right. I mean, so you got those issues. But your posture of meekness encouraged a posture of some meekness on their part as well. It brought them to some reasonableness. Yeah, Bob.
These were $1978.
Yeah.
So that would be multiple millions.
Oh, yeah.
And we were only a $1.5 to $2 million gross sales
Yeah.
annual business. So they were wrong, and they knew they were wrong. They were suing us about giving knowledge about a product that was sold by Standard Oil and advertised for the purpose that we used it.
Yeah.
So it was ridiculous. There was something else, which that doesn't take away from what you're saying, but we never found out why they were really suing us. So maybe it was because we had professed Christ and somebody got upset.
They didn't like that.
Did God ever discipline them as far as from a business standpoint?
Okay. Ken, you had your hand up. Ron, and now I see Scott.
As I look at Augustine's statement, I think of a little further down in history of the statement of Edmund Burke, who said, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. That runs really counter to what Augustine said. And in the last couple of weeks, I think I've seen something that's a good illustration of this. And some of you maybe have been seeing this on TV. And I think her name is Mia. She is an athlete, and she's been taking on the transgender
Yeah,
athletes.
yeah,
And she does not come across as arrogant.
right,
She's very meek in her presentation.
right,
But she's still saying, this is wrong.
yeah,
And, I'm not going to be silent on this issue.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a place where as Christians, if the ungodly is the only voice that's heard out there,
mm-hmm.
I mean, Jesus spoke up against evil.
Yeah,
And I think we have to do the same. We have to call sin when it is.
mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of my perspective on this.
Yeah, Scott.
I would second that. I think, I like Augustine's statement a lot better if you just said, to meek are those who generally.
Yeah,
And I think that would reconcile it with what Jesus said
Yeah.
a little further along. And I think that, this is really I remember when I was young in church, I got the impression that meek was weak.
uh-huh.
And it affected how I did things. When
Yeah.
I handled situations at school, I remember,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think it was good.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an important thing for young men especially, and for us as a church, to communicate this very well,
Yeah,
so that they really understand what
yeah,
a real Christian man should be,
yeah, Buck.
But Barclay said, strength under control. It
Strength
doesn't
under
say
control.
Unused, it's used under control. Jesus
Yeah.
lands with the temple and he chased the
Yeah.
money changers out.
There's a
But
time to
it
be
was
angry.
under control.
Yeah.
And it was appropriate. So I think it's, the under control is really a key thing.
That is a key thing, and Ken, getting to your point, one of the things that I see as a real distinction here is whether I am defending myself from weakness or defending others. And on this, I turn to the example of Carol's 7 times great-grandfather, Jacob Hochstetler. Jacob was an Amish man who came to America at the invitation of William Penn, settled in Pennsylvania, and over in the eastern, where the Amish folks are, over in Pennsylvania. And this is back in the 1700s, and as an Amish man, he was over the top passive. He would not fight, would not kill, under any circumstances, at all. And at one point in time, the local Native Americans came to their cabin basically to cause them harm. And they set the cabin on fire. They took Jacob's wife and killed her, killed the daughter, I think, Carol, and a son maybe, and Jacob and another son got away. At one point in time in the story, Jacob's son saw the family musket or whatever they had at the time that they used for hunting. He said, "Dad, we gotta defend ourselves." Jacob wouldn't let them. He steadfastly refused. As a result, I don't know if I can't say as a result, but the end result was he lost his wife and at least 1 or 2 children, but he and his son got away. They were held captive for many months, and they finally escaped. And and now Jacob's got like 1 million descendants, and there are TV shows about it and everything. And one of his 1 million descendants is Carol, 7 times great grandfather. And I thought about that story over and over in my mind, and I wrestled and wrestled and wrestled and wrestled. Yeah, I really admire his willingness to not fight, but there's no way I'm going to stand by and let somebody kill my wife. And kill me, that's okay. I'll turn my cheek for me, but I'm not sure I'm going to stand by and turn my cheek for Carol. I'm gonna. So I think there's a distinction there. And Scott, you made an allusion to learning about this in school, and it occurred to me, I remember there was a time, I was in 5th grade. My family had just moved from Cincinnati, where I spent my young childhood, up to Cuyahoga Falls, which is just north of Akron, Ohio. And brand new student at the school, and so all the kids are, testing me out to see, okay, what's this, what's that. And there was a guy who was bullying me. And I was a scrawny little kid. I mean, I was not going to try to fight this guy. He would have pounded me. And so I'm sitting there saying, what can I do? What can I do? And so I'm 10 years old, trying to figure this out for myself. Finally, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go up and talk to him. So one day at recess, I just go up to the guy and I say, look, you've just been picking on me. It's just going back and forth. Let's just put an end to this. Okay? I said, we're not going to be best buddies, but let's just agree to just let this put an end to it. I reach out my hand. I'm a 10-year-old kid. I reach out my hand to shake his hand. He looked at me like an idiot. He shook my hand. I walk away. As I'm walking away, I hear him just laughing his head off behind me. So I thought, okay, we'll see what happens. For whatever reason, he never bothered me again. I have no idea why. I certainly didn't put the fear of God into him. I mean, he could pound me. He knew he could pound me. But for whatever reason, he honored that, and I never had a problem with him. I don't know. I think that there is a lot more truth in choosing to be meek, choosing not to fight. I think there's more strength in that than we realize. Let me move on. This is going to be a 2-weeker, folks, so we're not going to get finished with this one today, I don't think. Let's get off of Augustine. Let's go to what George has to say. And I like George's better than Augustine's. George puts it this way: the meek are those who do not assert themselves, do not defend themselves, never dream of avenging themselves, or of returning anything but good for evil. Now there he's focusing on ourselves, our defense of self, an assertion of ourself. And this one, I feel a lot more comfortable with this one than I do with Augustine's. Although I'm not totally uncomfortable with Augustine's way of putting it. This one, I like the way he puts it. Let's go back several years when we were talking about Genesis and the fall. And at that time, I made the point, and I'm still wrestling with this in my mind, that in the fall, one of the things that happened with the fall of Adam is that mankind became self-aware. Remember, prior to the fall, Adam and Eve are naked and they're not ashamed, they don't care, they're running around happy, and it's like they're not even aware of their own circumstance. But with the fall, what happens? Adam realizes his nakedness, and even though the only other person on the planet is his wife, he feels a need to cover up. So does she. So they both cover up. And then, as part of the concealment, they hide from God. Never forget that. God does not hide from Adam. Adam hides from God. Okay? The separation is on the part of Adam, not on the part of God. And there's this self-awareness. And as I think about it, this self-awareness is so much at the root of so much of our sinfulness. Because with this self-awareness, we get this need for self-preservation, self-protection, self-promotion. So we start asserting ourselves in situations. We defend ourselves, and I did a lot of that this week that I'm not proud of. And then, we dream of avenging ourselves, okay? we're returning evil for evil. Okay? You know, how many times do we see it in fictional depictions where the good guy wins, but he wins by using the mechanisms of the bad guy. He just wins because he has bigger bombs, stronger horses, bigger swords, but he's still using the techniques and the strategies and the tactics of the evil guy. And I walk away from those depictions and I think, that's just not very satisfying. You know, the stronger guy won, but not necessarily the better guy. I mean, we return evil for evil. Yeah, Buck.
I disagree with the first statement that they don't assert themselves. I think Jesus asserted himself multiple times.
On whose behalf, though?
Hmm?
On whose behalf did Jesus assert himself?
But if that qualification isn't in what you quote. So I agree, but I say that, you know, going back to when we started this series, you said some people say that the elements that are determined in the mouth are not to be obeyed, but they're just sort of be taken as this high level of unattainable. I disagree on this basis. I think they are to be obeyed. I think that when we become the Christ, they become our model. And so if we assert ourselves as Jesus asserted himself, if we follow James when he said, be quick to hear, slow to anger, you know, and can learn those things, because a lot of us, we're all different. You know, a personality type, a high D is different than a high S and so forth. For some of us, it's much harder to learn. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. So, you know, I think you can still be asserting righteousness. It's, what I'm trying to say is when we do it for God, when God prompts us to do it, it's perfectly what we need to do.
Right.
When we do it for self equals flesh. When we're doing it in our flesh, it never works.
Right. And I've read enough of MacDonald's writings that when he says they do not assert themselves, he's talking about asserting themselves for the purpose of promoting themselves and their own flesh, promoting, you know, I'm a great guy. Y'all have to look up to me and follow me. To assert myself on behalf of God, I'm asserting God. And that's the way George would have said that. Carol.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the judge in Airy, female judge.
Okay.
That she didn't assert herself, even though she was in a man's world.
Mm-hmm.
But she humbled herself.
Yeah. Right.
That's the kind of example I think that some women are trying to make it to the next step, and they feel like they have to fight. But she never did. She knew who the Lord was.
Right,
and
right.
it was over. I'm not explaining it very well.
No, you're right. Akron, Ohio, you know, back in the 70s, you know, was completely run by men, as everybody else was. But there was a particular judge that Carol's referring to, who was a Christian. She was the daughter of a very prominent pastor up there, and she did not assert herself. She did not come out and try to promote herself as this, you know, paragon of legal virtue. She was very humble about it. She won. She kept winning re-election, and she succeeded in what she was doing, and she didn't have to assert herself. So yeah, that was a very, very good point. And she was a leader in that. Now, Summit County, that's the county that Akron is in, I believe, I haven't checked recently, but I believe there was a time when every elected judge in Summit County, Ohio was a female. And in fact, all county-wide elected officials in Summit County, Ohio, at least at one time, were all female. So it's kind of interesting. Yes, Scott?
Yeah, I was just looking at the way this is worded. I think he's saying he's assuming it's never good to defend yourself. It's the way it's worded. And I think it's sometimes good to defend yourself for the the sake of the other person. You know, if somebody's,
Yeah.
attacking you,
Yeah.
and you assert yourself or defend yourself, then ultimately that can be a good thing for both of you.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that also to say that I've been reading unspoken sermons of McDonald, so I'm a fan because of you. So I'm
Hallelujah.
against McDonald. I'm just saying, I think it's assuming that it's always good to refrain from defending yourself. I don't know if that's true.
Virgil, could that word assert have changed in meaning over the years?
It could be. He wrote this back in the 1800s. Let me say
To
this.
assert yourself is not a bad thing today. To assert yourself is to use the gifts God gave you
Okay.
today.
Yeah, that's not what he's referring to.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Let me say this and let me close. We're over time. We'll come back next week to talk about what it means to inherit the earth, because that's an even bigger controversy. Let me say this, and this is going to what Scott was saying. One of the challenges of even a Sunday school class like this is that we are trying to take the whole universe of thoughts, feelings, actions with all of their nuances and express them in words. Semantics. This is why I always say, semantics is all we've got. The only way we can communicate this stuff is through words. And with words, you have one word following another. Each word has its definition, and we all hear the words differently. I read this and I said, hallelujah, no reservations. Okay? Others you are reading the same thing and finding all kinds of reservations because you're reading different things into the words than I'm reading into the words.
Sure.
That's the challenge that we have in a setting like this. Let's just, I think we can agree that life is full of nuances. What I would say here, I would like to echo the attitude of Greg Boyd. Because my son and I were listening to a podcast by Greg Boyd on this whole issue of violence. When is it good to return violence for violence? At what point in time do we take up in arms to defend ourselves or defend our family, etc.? And Greg Boyd comes from an Anabaptist background, and so he's more pacifist in it. And I like the attitude he says, look, all the situations are nuanced, and I can't give a one-size-fits-all solution. But his attitude was, let's not use our violent defense of self as our first option. And all too often, and I'll probably ruffle some feathers, especially here in America, and especially here in Southern America, okay, where our congressman has an assault rifle on his political yard sign, sometimes the violent response is our first option. In our culture, that's our first option. And we sometimes glorify the person who uses that as a first option. And my challenge to us is to let us think a little bit and think, maybe there are better first options. Maybe we can follow the example of Buck's company, who on blind faith, almost blind, that's probably too strong a word, but on pure faith, went to the scriptures and they said, you know what, this is what the Bible says, let's just try it. Let's try and do what Jesus said to do. Somebody's suing us to take our coat, we'll give them our cloak also. And they did that, and it worked out well. It worked out well. And so I think, we can step out on faith and courage and strength, as they did, and say, I'm going to obey Jesus in this, and I'm not going to use the violent response as my first option. I'm going to try the response that Jesus says. That's, I think that's the best we can do in trying to apply semantics to the nuances of life. Okay, come back next week. We'll talk about inheriting the earth. Let me close this in prayer.
And Virgil, can we bless 10-year-old you? That was such, I'm serious, that is such a beautiful story. I don't, how God blessed you at 10 is something that I'm praying for at 42. I mean, that's beautiful.
Well, I didn't have any option. The guys want to pound me anyway.
No,
Yeah.
we did not that, though,
Yeah.
in bullying situations. We did not that.
Yeah.
And that's so beautiful, so I just bless that. So
Where it
amazing.
started, right?
Oh, Father, we do thank you. I thank you for a group of people that we can talk and share our hearts, disagree and agree, and walk out loving each other. Father, I just pray that that you will be with us as we go into the service. Bless our speaker, Ben, as he shares his heart with us. Be with the pastor and the worship team as they lead us in worship and bring us to your throne. Father, I pray that you'll help us. Give us the wisdom that we need to understand meekness. This was something that was so important to you. You exhibited it in your own life.
Yes.
Moses, you praised as being the meekest man on earth. And yet, look at the powerful things that he did.
Yes.
Help us to see where this all fits into our lives. Help us to learn that meekness that will call down your strength in our lives. Father, I pray now that you'll be with us throughout the rest of this day, and we thank you for all that you've done for us. In Jesus' name, amen.